Welcome to The Big Picture. This is Frank Gaffney. I'm delighted to be able to present to you a conversation with one of the most impressive national security practitioners I've had the privilege of knowing in the space of 40 years in that business. His name is Robert Joseph. He completed a series of positions in government, starting working with me in the Reagan Defense Department, through the National Security Council, the State Department, ultimately serving as an ambassador in a couple of roles, and finishing up his career in government as the Undersecretary of State, who had the portfolio of arms control and international security affairs. He is an extraordinary resource for those of us who are trying to make sense of successive efforts our government has made over many presidencies and many decades to contend with the phenomenon of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction through, in particular, arms control efforts, most of which have proved unavailing. And Bob Joseph, I think it's fair to say that's true of North Korea especially. And I wanted to start this part of our conversation with you by asking about recent developments, some of which I must say I was surprised at, including a submarine launch of a ballistic missile very recently, which opens up a whole new range of threatening capabilities for the North Koreans, does it not?
It does indeed. And Frank, thank you for the invitation to be here.
It's great to have you with us.
The North Koreans have been working very hard to expand their nuclear capabilities. They have not only expanded the number of warheads that they have, but the delivery systems and the diversity in the delivery systems, starting with medium-range Scud missiles, moving to ICBM-capable missiles, now moving to mobile ICBMs, which provides them greater survivability against our countermeasures. And as you say, even more recently, with their submarine-launched ballistic missile capability. It is a very aggressive modernization, very aggressive buildup. And we also know that they're working on hypersonic capabilities for the future. This is a country that has set weaponization of its nuclear capability as perhaps the greatest priority for the regime.
This is on top of some 4 million men and women under arms, in addition to other weapons of mass destruction programs. We don't know as much about them than we do the nuclear ones, and we don't know as much as we'd like about even the nuclear ones, but chemical weapons, biological weapons. This is a kind of leave no stone unturned approach. And what's so stunning about it really is it is being mounted by a country that has essentially bankrupted itself and can only do this sort of thing with the kindness of its friends and help, and at the extreme privation of its own people. Is that a fair representation? This is not an inexpensive undertaking, the military capabilities North Korea has amassed.
In terms of the national resources of North Korea, a significant amount is going to their nuclear program and their military overall, as you say, with millions of men and women under arms. It is a country that values this capability for a good number of reasons, including export. And we need to think about North Korea as a provider not just of ballistic missiles, which they have been for decades, but in the future providing nuclear capabilities. I see no reason from their perspective why they wouldn't do that. As you say, they're destitute economically, a bankrupt regime. They've been demonstrating that they're willing to sell anything that they have as long as the customer has the cash to buy it.
Right. That can be an affordable proposition, particularly for countries that don't want to go to the trouble of building their own infrastructure and having the capacity to manufacture these exotic weapons by themselves. So that makes the world a more dangerous place, I think it's safe to say, not only because of the threat posed by the North Korean government itself, that regime, again, being one of the most horrifically brutal to its own people of any in the world. And I'm fond of saying that any government that treats its own people that badly is not likely to have much in the way of tender mercies for anybody else, especially those like us and our people that they consider to be principal enemies. So we have found that despite a host of efforts over a sustained period of time, with, in the case of the Trump administration, without the help of the Chinese Communist Party, our efforts to persuade the North Koreans to give up these weapons, to get out of this business, have been unavailing. Specifically, I'd like you just to talk a little bit about the Trump efforts, because I actually was very skeptical about its utility, honestly, but thought that at least it had the merits of cutting the Chinese out. A foolish idea that I think has persisted for far too long, and as you say, has not gone away even now. But how would you characterize that effort and what came of it?
Well, first, I do want to say that I think you're absolutely right about the priorities of the Kim dynasty. They do not care about their own people. They've demonstrated a willingness to let their people starve, literally starve, in order to feed the elite and sustain the regime. And part of sustaining the regime is their nuclear program and the broader military capability. In terms of the Trump administration approach, I was always very skeptical because I have seen effort after effort, initiative after initiative in the diplomatic sphere to negotiate. I no longer believe that negotiation is a feasible sort of way to stop the program and to get North Korea to, as we say, denuclearize, which has been the objective of Republican and Democratic administrations going really back decades now. The notion that North Korea would trade its nuclear program for condos on the beach, which would be sort of economic reasons and to bring North Korea into the 21st century, is one that simply doesn't resonate with the leadership. I mean, I think you have to think of this leadership really as a gangster-like regime.
Some called it a cult on top of it, which is a pretty unappetizing combination.
Right. It is indeed. I don't think that's how we're going to make progress. And if you look at not just Trump, but the previous administration, the previous administrations going back to at least to Bill Clinton and the 1994 agreed framework, we have been unsuccessful at every turn of events. And we've always said, well, maybe there's one more thing that we can put on the negotiating table. Maybe there's one more thing that we can give the North Koreans, concession after concession. And of course, the North Koreans take the concessions. And you're in a situation where you're providing really a second lifeline to North Korea to continue not only the repression of the people, the brutal treatment of the people, but the nuclear program itself.
Yeah, no, it's a complete nonsense. But Bob, I think something that you just touched on there is really important to this, and it's something I've admired about you throughout our long relationship. Your appreciation of the importance of the character of the regime itself to the ultimate utility of any of these negotiations, or even, as you say, the 1994 framework agreement, which was hailed at the time as a great accomplishment because we'd finally gotten, well, peace in our time, I guess some might say. How did that work out? And to what extent is it axiomatic that as long as you're dealing with people who don't give a fig about any of their commitments and are indeed so committed to pursuing this aggressive behavior that they'll let their people starve to death in order to accomplish it. I mean, how could one leave that out of the equation when you're calculating whether these kinds of exercises are of any utility at all?
Well, two things. First, I think you're right. North Korea has violated every commitment it has made, whether it's the agreed framework or the North-South denuclearization agreement. It just won
the armistice, among other things.
Every agreement. And so, given this pattern, you have to ask yourself, is the end result of a negotiation, even if you could get them to agree, would they actually implement? And given the totalitarian nature of the regime, I think the answer is clearly no. To answer your question, my sense has been for a long time that as long as this regime remains in control of North Korea, they are going to not only retain their nuclear capability, they're going to expand that nuclear capability. And so the issue then becomes not so much the nuclear program as the regime itself.
Yes.
And I have concluded, based on my experiences, that the best way to solve the nuclear problem is to eliminate the regime. And this is not regime change from without. This is not going to war. The last thing we want, I think, is an armed conflict on the peninsula. It would be catastrophic in terms of the consequences.
Yes.
But we can contain, as we did the Soviet Union. And remember, the Soviet Union had thousands of missiles aimed at us. We can contain, we can deny it certain capabilities, which we did with the Soviet Union. We can promote, as President Reagan did, promote human rights as a central element of our policy. I think this is the way forward, because this regime does not have the legitimacy of the people. Yes, it's got loyalty, at least for now, of the elites, but not the people.
Subject to change.
Subject to change, and we can play an active role in changing that.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that up, Bob, because, of course, we had formative experiences early in our respective careers. You're much more distinguished than mine. But with Reagan moving inexorably on a strategy of taking down the Soviet Union, containing it was something that was done to varying degrees by previous governments of the United States. There was a dalliance with this idea that we could engage the Soviets, we could have détente with them, as you know. But Reagan came to office with a very specific purpose in mind and a mandate to pursue it, which was, as he famously put it, we win, they lose. That seems to me to be, along with your experiences in Libya, a much more encouraging and promising route to go if you're actually going to try to contain and eliminate, ultimately, a terrible threat like this one. And as you said, if you could do it with the Soviet Union, for heaven's sakes, you certainly ought to be able to do it with a relatively minor player like the North Koreans. One of the things that is brooded at the moment, though, Bob, as you know, is an idea that we ought to actually invest even more in obtaining pieces of paper with the North Korean regime in a way that is even more problematic, arguably, than some of the failed practices of the past, the six-party talks and the framework agreement and so on. Talk a little bit about this idea that is now contained in what's called H.R. 3446, the so-called Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act, and what, if its direction were followed in terms of getting a declaration of peace or a treaty of peace with the North Korean government, might eventuate.
Frank, I would just add that in order to be successful with North Korea, we also need to be able to defend and to deter, which requires, I think, us to ensure that our forces and the forces of our allies are capable of defeating an attack that might come from the North. And in terms of deterrence, we should be strengthening our nuclear deterrent posture, including through our declaratory policy. And one of the things that the Biden administration is reportedly seriously considering is a no first use policy, which would be totally detrimental to the credibility of our nuclear guarantee in the eyes of both our adversaries and our allies.
Yes, I'm so glad you brought that up. They've been trying to bob and weave a little bit about this, saying, well, their nuclear posture review is not actually going to recommend a no first use strategy, but a sole purpose strategy. Is there a dime's worth of difference between the two? And why is this so important? You've spent your life in this battle space. Why does it matter that we are preserving the option to use nuclear weapons in circumstances in which a conventional attack has taken place?
Well, let me say that President Biden, when he was Vice President Biden and when he was Senator Biden, always supported a no first use. And this notion that there's a difference between no first use and sole use is, to me, rather silly. And it certainly escapes the understanding of our adversaries and of our allies. In terms of why the option of using nuclear weapons first, in case of a biological attack or a wide-scale chemical attack or a massive sort of conventional attack, this is about deterrence. It's about deterring the adversary from taking these measures against us, measures that could have catastrophic effect. Right. And to me,
which is fundamentally a calculation of costs versus benefits, right?
Absolutely, and risk, cost, benefits, and risks alike. I would just point out that our allies in Europe and our allies in Asia are absolutely of the same mind that we should not take this step. You get nothing in return, and all you do is reap the uncertainty and the erosion of the credibility of your nuclear guarantee. I come at this from a non-proliferation perspective. The most important tool we have in terms of our non-proliferation toolkit is our nuclear guarantee.
If we don't credibly contribute to deterrence of attacks against our allies, they have every incentive to try to get their own credible deterrent, and a nuclear one at that.
Yes, absolutely. And in terms of the congressional initiative to put more on the table, let's have a declaration that hostilities have ceased, or let's have a peace treaty with North Korea. This is a very old idea. I mean, what you find over the course of decades is that we simply recycle these old, failed ideas, and here it is again.
Yeah. Here it is again. Not so much we do, but the people who embrace these ideas seem to come back to them endlessly.
Right. And I would say both Republican and Democratic administrations.
That's fair, but I just wanted to be differentiating between us on this one. But Bob, here's the thing, and I'm so glad again you've recalled Senator Biden's personal history in this regard. My understanding is that he was an early beneficiary of the support of a radical leftist entity called the Council for a Livable World. We've been in these long-running battles with groups like this in the arms control arena for a long time. The Council for a Livable World had been promoting the unilateral disarmament of the United States way back when Joe Biden was first cutting his teeth on getting into political life. And he was one of their very first both supporters and beneficiaries of the Council for a Livable World support. And so his own attachment to these ideas, and specifically to the purpose of denuclearizing not our enemies, though that was always supposedly going to flow from us setting an example for it, but denuclearizing us, is of a piece now with what I think is afoot here in this so-called 3446 resolution. If the proponents had their way, just for the purpose of discussion, and the North Koreans were to go along with having some kind of agreement, some sort of treaty or declaration or whatever, to end formally the Korean War. What would be the practical consequence of that in your professional estimation, Bob Joseph?
Well, first of all, I would say that even though I don't quote Bob Gates, former Secretary of Defense, very often, I think he was absolutely right when he pointed out that Joe Biden has been wrong on every national security issue for the last 40 years.
Right.
Okay. In terms of the legislative initiative, and it's beyond that, it's much broader than that, in terms of the support for this idea, once again, as I say, resurfacing. Bad ideas never seem to go away in Washington or in other capitals. But I think, first of all, there would be the question of what do you pay for this? North Koreans have always demanded a very high price for rhetorical statements, okay, for papers, paper commitments that they have no intention of following, as we talked about before. But it also legitimizes the North Korean nuclear program, okay, because now you have an agreement with, and this was one of my concerns about President Trump's initiatives. I mean, you give legitimacy to this gangster state, and I think you undercut, in the eyes of our other allies, perhaps not the Moon government in Seoul, but our other allies, the credibility of the United States.
Mm-hmm. The credibility of the United States. Yeah.
There's no benefit to this other than to have a photo op and to sign another meaningless piece of paper.
Right. But there is a very distinct probability, I think it's fair to say, speaking of the Moon government in South Korea, that piece of paper would translate into a very marked change in the defense posture of South Korea, specifically American forces there. Talk us through that, if you would.
Well, I think the Moon government has demonstrated that it's willing to make concession after concession to North Korea and get absolutely nothing in return. I think the Moon government, and if you look at the background of the key players in the Moon government, you've got to be concerned,
yes.
Because not only are there leanings toward North Korea, but they're anti-U.S., they're anti-American. And I think you're right. I think if we did move forward with this charade and have a peace treaty, a so-called peace treaty, I think the result would be much lower defense resources for the South Korean military. And the South Korean military today plays a very important role in deterrence. What we need is not another piece of paper. What we need is to move beyond thinking about diplomacy as a strategy to a comprehensive strategy. Diplomacy will be part of it, but not this type of silly diplomacy. But it'll also include those things that we were talking about before, denying North Korea capabilities, ensuring that we have a sound defense, ensuring that we have a credible nuclear deterrent. That's what makes up a strategy, while we wait for and encourage through our actions the end of this regime.
Amen. The thing that I'm particularly concerned about, Bob, is that in addition to a diminishing of the South Koreans' capability, there would almost certainly be an insistence by the Moon government that U.S. forces be removed from the peninsula. And then, I fear, it's game on for the North Korean regime. This must not come to pass. I hope that this program, among others, will contribute to a clarity about the inadvisability of, as you say, yet another empty set of commitments from the North and yet another invitation for its further future and very dangerous aggression. We can't let that happen. Bob Joseph, thank you specifically for the emphasis you've placed on the nature of the regime in the North to any future prospect for real peace on the peninsula. I hope you found this as interesting as I have and that you will come back for more of the big picture in the days ahead. Until then, this is Frank Gaffney. Thanks for joining us.